has a way of connecting people to each other by telling stories and expressing emotions. However, no other genre of music has been able to fuse together so many different types of music like rock and roll has done. Rock and roll has fused together the sounds of country, R&B, and even some gospel music. From the soulful sound of Muddy Waters to the psychedelic sensation of Pink Floyd to the hair metal ballads of Def Leppard and even the headbanging sounds of Pantera, all of these groups have a way of invoking different emotions within us. Today I would like to talk about the evolution of rock and roll, where it began, and what influences it has had on the American culture. There has been a lot of controversy surrounding when rock and roll originally emerged. According to an article by Prina Das titled Evolution of Rock Music in 2013, many historians believe that rock and roll goes all the way back to the 1920s. However, during this period, it would have been known as rhythm and blues, or R&B. The article goes on to explain that R&B was originally created by African Americans during slavery in the South, even before the 1920s. The African Americans were brought over to America as slaves, and before the Civil War, they were made to work in plantations in the South. While working on the plantations, they would use their singing and their songs to communicate to each other, as well as to pass time during the day. This style of music was passed down from generations to generations, even after slavery was abolished, which started a new musical movement known today as rhythm and blues. The style of music was then transformed from the fields of the plantations onto the stage. It was then in the 1920s we were introduced to R&B artists such as Mamie Smith, Blind Lemon Jefferson, Bessie Smith, Blind Willie Johnson, and the legendary Louis Armstrong. Without the heart and soul of rhythm and blues, it is quite possible we would not have the musical influences that helped transform a new wave of music that was being introduced and discovered. In the late 1940s into the early 50s, a new sound of music began to emerge. The term rhythm and blues or R&B did not adequately describe the new sound that was hitting the airwaves. According to an article published by Mission.org titled The Evolution of Rock in March of 2019, the term rock and roll was coined in 1951 by a popular Cleveland radio host named Alan Freed. The article goes on to explain that due to the growing popularity of this new sound, Alan Freed hosted the very first rock and roll concert, and it was called Moonlight Carnation Ball on March 21st, 1952 in Cleveland, Ohio. While this discovery and excitement was happening in Ohio, new artists were emerging onto the scene by way of a little studio tucked away in Memphis, Tennessee called Sun Studio, which was managed by Sam Phillips. Sam Phillips was unconventional in his music managing method by letting anyone walk in off the street and record. He wanted to hear the more human and emotional side of the music, and he welcomed any and all imperfections. This way of managing introduced us to many legends, and he was the first to record some of rock and roll's most influential artists such as Elvis Presley and B.B. King, as well as Johnny Cash and Jerry Lee Lewis, and even Ike Turner and Carl Perkins. Each decade of music has brought on many changes, but none has been as influential as the 1950s due to the new wave of music that we now call rock and roll. The influences of the 1950s brought us some of the most iconic artists throughout the later decades. The sound of rock and roll was ever-changing throughout the decades, and each band had adapted their own sound, making a lot of bands iconic in their own unique way. Artists such as the Rolling Stones and the Beatles in the 1960s, to Journey and Black Sabbath in the 1970s, and even Metallica and Guns N' Roses in the 1980s. They all have influences from early R&B artists such as Robert Johnson, as well as early pioneers of rock and roll such as Elvis Presley. However, each band had their own style influenced by a different genre of rock and roll. Not only are bands influenced by the rock and roll genre of music, but so is our society and our American culture. According to an article published by R&R Journal titled How Rock and Roll Changed American Culture in 2020, it states that, quote, one of the more positive changes rock and roll brought to American society is integration. Although rock and roll was predominantly white in earlier years, it welcomed people of different races soon enough, end quote. Rock and roll also shows integration by using blues and jazz roots, and these genres were popular in the Black American culture. Rock and roll not only helped us overcome racial prejudice, though. According to the article, it also states that rock and roll started to emerge when World War II was ending, and that the dramatic effects of the war and everything to do with it had caused the rapid spread of rock and roll. From artists such as Louis Armstrong in the 1920s to the present-day artists such as Black Label Society, rock and roll touches on the gamut of emotions we feel as human beings. You can hear sadness in Eric Clapton's acoustic guitar solos, to the emerging sensation in the riffs played in Zakk Wylde's electric guitar. Whether you like listening to soft rock or you like listening to heavy metal, it is important that we not forget where rock and roll first started and the way it has inspired our music and our culture today. Little Richard described it best in his 1995 speech at the concert for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Rhythm and blues had a baby and they called it rock and roll.